There are photographs that should never exist. Images so disturbing that medical professionals have debated whether showing them violates human dignity itself. In a forgotten corner of rural Virginia in 1971, a young woman gave birth to something that challenged everything we thought we knew about human genetics, family bloodlines, and the darkest secrets families will kill to protect. Her name was Sarah May Whitaker. And when the doctors first saw what emerged from her womb, 3 of them walked out of the delivery room. One never practiced medicine again. The child born that October morning wasn't just the product of incest. It was the culmination of something far more sinister, a bloodline so tangled, so corrupted by generations of deliberate inbreeding that scientists would later call it impossible. Yet the medical records exist, the photographs exist, the child existed for the brief time it was allowed to breathe. But here's what will haunt you long after this video ends. Sarah May was 17 years old, and when authorities demanded to know who the father was, every adult, male in her family, her father, her uncle, her grandfather, even her own brother claimed responsibility. Not out of shame or confession, but out of pride. They were protecting something they called the pure line, a family tradition that had been carefully maintained for over a century in the hills of Appalachia, where outsiders never ventured and questions were answered with violence. The child lived for 6 days. In those 6 days, it would rewrite medical textbooks and reveal a family secret so grotesque that the FBI would eventually classify the case files, sealing them away from public view for 50 years. Those files were quietly declassified in 2021. Almost no one noticed. Almost no one knows what they contain. Tonight, you're going to learn why some truths are buried so deep that even speaking them aloud feels like trespassing on sacred, cursed ground. The Whitaker name first appeared in the census records of Roanoke County, Virginia in 1847 when Joshua Whitaker claimed 200 acres of mountain land that no other settler wanted. The soil was poor, the winters brutal, and the nearest town was a 3-day ride through treacherous terrain. But Joshua wasn't looking for prosperity. He was looking for isolation, and in those remote hollers where morning mist clung to the mountainsides like secrets refusing to lift, the Whitaker family began an experiment that would span 5 generations. Joshua brought with him 2 wives, his legal wife Martha and her younger sister Rebecca, who he claimed as a companion under frontier law. The local preacher, desperate for any congregation in the wilderness, blessed both unions. By 1855, Joshua had fathered 14 children between the 2 sisters. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. When those children came of age, they didn't seek spouses from neighboring families. They married each other. The family journals discovered decades later in a hidden cellar beneath the original homestead reveal a disturbing philosophy. Joshua believed that mixing bloodlines weakened the human spirit, diluted what he called the divine essence that God had placed in his family line. He convinced his children that they were chosen, special, and that their purity must be preserved at all costs. By the 1880s, the Whitaker family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a twisted vine looping back on itself again and again. The children born from these unions were different. Neighbors whispered about the Whitaker offspring who never spoke, who walked with strange gaits, whose eyes held an emptiness that seemed to look through you rather than at you. Local doctors refused to attend Whitaker births after 1890, claiming the family was cursed. But the Fammies didn't see curse. They saw perfection. Each generation doubled down on the practice, convinced that they were approaching some kind of genetic ideal that the outside world was too corrupt to understand. By 1920, the Whitaker bloodline had become something that defied natural law. What started as marriages between siblings had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. The family had developed what they called the rotation system, a carefully planned schedule where each fertile woman would bear children to multiple male relatives in a predetermined order. They kept meticulous records, treating human reproduction like a breeding program for livestock. Sarah May's grandmother, Charity Whitaker, was born in 1925 as the product of a union between her mother and 3 different men: her grandfather, her grandfather's brother, and her own uncle. The genetic analysis, conducted decades later, would reveal that Charity's DNA contained patterns that should have been biologically impossible. She was simultaneously her mother's daughter, niece, and cousin. Her chromosomes told a story of such concentrated inbreeding that modern geneticists initially assumed the test results were contaminated. But Charity survived, and more disturbing still, she thrived within the family's twisted ecosystem. She grew up believing that the outside world was populated by inferior beings, genetic mongrels, who had corrupted their bloodlines with foreign influences. By age 15, she was pregnant with her first child, fathered by her own father, who was also her uncle and her cousin. This child, Thomas Whitaker, would grow up to become Sarah May's father, though the term father loses all meaning when you understand the true nature of the family structure. The Whitas had created their own isolated society with its own rules, its own logic, and its own definition of normal. Children grew up not knowing which adults were their parents, siblings, or cousins, because these distinctions had long since ceased to matter. Everyone was related to everyone else in multiple ways, and they spoke in weighed whispers about the blood calling to blood and believed that each new generation brought them closer to achieving what they called the perfect circle, a state of genetic purity that would grant them abilities beyond ordinary human understanding. By the 1960s, when Sarah May was born, the family had been completely isolated from the outside world for over a century. They had their own language, their own customs, and their own terrible secret that they guarded more fiercely than their lives. That secret was about to be born into the world, and, when it was, it would shatter every assumption about the limits of human genetic deformity. Sarah May Whitaker was 17 when she realized she was carrying something that felt different from the other pregnancies she had witnessed in her family. By that age, she had already given birth twice, once at 14, once at 16, but both children had died within hours of birth, their tiny bodies too malformed to sustain life. The family called these deaths offerings to the blood, necessary sacrifices on the path to genetic perfection. But this pregnancy was different. Sarah May could feel the child moving in ways that defied explanation. Instead of the gentle kicks and rolls of a normal fetus, she described sensations that terrified even her hardened relatives. The child seemed to pulse rather than move, creating rhythmic waves across her abdomen that resembled nothing so much as trapped lightning. Her belly grew to an enormous size by the 7th month, stretching her skin until it was translucent and showing a network of dark veins that seemed to writhe beneath the surface. The family was ecstatic. The elders whispered that this was finally it, the culmination of their century-long breeding program. They had achieved something beyond human, something that would prove their superiority to the corrupt outside world. They prepay. Read for the birth with the fervor of religious zealots, setting up elaborate rituals and ceremonies to welcome what they believed would be their genetic messiah. But Sarah May was dying. The pregnancy was consuming her body from the inside out. She lost 40 pulses even as her belly continued to expand. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her teeth loosened and began to fall from her gums. Most disturbing of all, her eyes began to change color, shifting from brown to an unnatural pale yellow that seemed to glow in darkness. The family interpreted these changes as signs of divine transformation, but medical experts who later reviewed her case files recognized them as symptoms of severe genetic toxicity. Her body was literally being poisoned by the abnormal fetus growing inside her. When Sarah May went into labor on October 13, 1971, she had been unconscious for 3 days. The family had carried her to the nearest hospital, a small rural facility 30 miles away, only because they wanted medical documentation of what they believed would be the birth of a new form of human being. They never imagined that this decision would expose their secret to the outside world, or that the child Sarah May delivered would become the subject of classified government research for the next 50 years. Dr. Margaret Powell had delivered over 3,000 house babies in her 20-year career at Mercy General Hospital. She had seen every complication, every deformity, every tragedy that human birth could produce. But when the Whitaker family carried Sarah May through the emergency room doors that October morning, Dr. Powell knew immediately that she was about to witness something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The birth lasted 14 hours. Sarah May never regained consciousness. Her body racked by contractions so violent that they shattered 2 of her ribs. The medical team struggled to monitor the fetus because its heartbeat produced patterns that their equipment couldn't properly read. Instead of the steady rhythm of a normal heart, the monitors showed irregular clusters of activity that resembled brain waves more than cardiac function. Nurse Patricia Williams, who assisted with the delivery, later testified that the sound coming from Sarah May's womb wasn't the usual fetal heartbeat, but something that sounded almost like whispering. When the child finally emerged, the delivery room fell into complete silence. What Dr. Powell saw defied every principle of human anatomy she had ever learned. The infant was technically alive. It breathed, its heart beat, its eyes moved, but it was shaped in ways that seemed to mock the very concept of human form. Its skull was grossly enlarged, nearly twice the size of a normal newborn's head, but transparent enough that the brain was visible through the skin. That brain was unlike anything in medical literature. Instead of the normal folded structure, it appeared to be composed of dozens of smaller separate organs that pulsed independently of each other. The child's limbs were fused in impossible configurations. Its arms emerged from its torso at wrong angles, ending in hands that had too many fingers arranged in spirals patterns. Its legs were twisted around each other like vines, and where feet should have been, there were instead formations that resembled tiny faces, complete with moving eyes and mouths that opened and closed soundlessly. Most disturbing of all was the child's face, or faces, because there were 3 of them overlapping and sharing features in a way that created an expression of constant, silent screaming. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because what happened next would test the limits of human compassion and medical ethics in ways that still divide experts today. The child was alive, but was it human? Did it deserve to live, or was keeping it alive an act of cruelty beyond meat? Sure, Dr. Powell had 6 days to answer questions that would challenge everything she believed about medicine, morality, and the nature of life itself. The child that Sarah May delivered was not supposed to survive. Every medical principle suggested that such severe deformities would be incompatible with life. Yet somehow this twisted amalgamation of human genetics continued to breathe, to move, to exist in a state that challenged the very definition of living. Dr. Powell made the decision to keep it alive, not out of hope, but out of a terrible scientific curiosity about what the limits of human biology could actually sustain. For 6 days, the medical staff at Mercy General Hospital became reluctant witnesses to something that felt more like a supernatural phenomenon than a medical case. The child never cried. Instead, it produced sounds that nurses described as somewhere between humming and static electricity. Its multiple eyes moved independently, tracking different objects around the room with an intelligence that seemed impossible given its malformed brain structure. Most unsettling of all, it appeared to respond to the presence of its family members in ways that suggested recognition, even affection. The Whitaker family maintained a constant vigil around the child's incubator. They spoke to it in their strange dialect, sang songs that no one else could understand, and performed rituals that horrified the hospital staff. They brought objects from their mountain home, twisted pieces of wood, stones arranged in specific patterns, and photographs of other family members that showed generations of increasingly severe deformities. They called the child the culmination and the perfect one, treating it with a reverence that was both touching and deeply disturbing. But the child was dying, and its death was unlike anything medical science had documented. Instead of the gradual organ failure typical of severely malformed infants, this child seemed to be dissolving from the inside out. Its transparent skin began to shunt, dark patches where internal structure, res, were breaking down, but rather than causing distress, these changes seemed to bring the child a kind of peace. Its multiple faces, which had shown constant agitation for the first 5 days, began to relax into expressions of something that almost resembled contentment. On the 6th day, as the morning shift arrived to check on the child, they found something that would haunt them forever. The child was still alive, still breathing, but during the night it had somehow managed to arrange itself into a position that was geometrically impossible given its fused limbs. It lay in the incubator in a perfect spiral, its twisted body forming a pattern that resembled ancient symbols none of the staff could identify. And in that position, with what appeared to be a smile on each of its 3 faces, the child finally died, taking with it the darkest secret of American family, genetics, and leaving behind questions that remain unanswered to this day. Within hours of the child's death, Mercy General Hospital was swarmed by federal agents. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, wearing suits that seemed out of place in rural Virginia, carrying briefcases and equipment that the hospital staff had never seen before. They claimed to be from the Centers for Disease Control, investigating what they called a potential genetic hazard to public health. But Dr. Powell knew immediately that these men were something else entirely. The agents confiscated everything. The child's body, all medical records, the photographs the family had brought, even the twisted pieces of wood from their mountain home. They interviewed every staff member who had contact with the case, requiring them to sign documents that legally prohibited them from ever discussing what they had witnessed. The official death certificate listed the cause as multiple congenital anomalies, a bland medical term that revealed nothing about the true horror of what had occurred. Sarah May died 3 days later, her body finally succumbing to the genetic toxicity that had been consuming her throughout the pregnancy. The Whitaker family, devastated by the loss of what they considered their greatest achievement, retreated back to their mountain compound and were never seen in public again. Local authorities who attempted to investigate their property in the following years reported finding the buildings abandoned, though neighbors insisted they could still hear voices singing in the woods on certain nights. The classified files released 50 years later revealed the truth that the government worked so hard to hide. The child born to Sarah May Whitaker represented something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human genetics and evolution. Its DNA contained sequences that appeared to be entirely artificial, as if someone had been deliberately manipulating the family's genetic code for generations. Most disturbing of all, analysis of the family's genealogical records revealed that their breeding program hadn't been random or accidental. It had been following a specific pattern, a genetic formula that seemed designed to produce exactly what Sarah May had given birth to. The final page of the classified report contains a single chilling paragraph. The Whitaker case suggests the possibility of intentional genetic experimentation spanning multiple generations conducted by unknown parties for unknown purposes. The family's isolation and systematic breeding program indicate a level of organization and long-term planning that exceeds what would be expected from isolated rural populations. Further investigation is recommended to determine if similar programs exist elsewhere in the United States. That investigation never happened, at least not officially, but somewhere in the mountains of Appalachia, in places where outsiders never venture and questions are still answered with violence. There may be other families following other programs, working toward other culminations that we're not prepared to understand. The story of Sarah May Whitaker and her impossible child is over, But the questions it raises about the hidden corners of American genetics and the forces that might be manipulating them remain as dark and unanswered as the mountain hollers where such secrets are born.